Yeah, he handed me a bottle of water. It makes me think of that story about the grandmother that had brought her grandson to church for the first time. He was about 3 or 4 years old, and he watched the preacher get up, and he set him down a glass of water, and reached in his pocket, pulled out his handkerchief, put it there, and reached over and grabbed his watch and laid it there. The little boy said to his grandma, said, "What's that all about?" He said, "Well, when he preaches really hard, and he puts his heart into it, and he starts perspiring, and so he needs to wipe his brow." He said, "Well, what's the water for?" "Well, his throat gets dry, and so he has to take a drink of water every now and then." He said, "Well, what's the watch for?" She said, "Never mind, he doesn't pay attention to it anyway." So, but I do pay attention, so. Well, you got your Bibles? We'll turn to the book of Job. The book of Job. And so I'm just going to conduct this like a Bible class, if you don't mind. I mean, I can lecture you all the way through this, but I can ask you questions too. See if we can get some people thinking in here. Tell me what the book of Job is about. Somebody tell me what the book of Job is about. Don't be afraid. Don't be bashful. It's just us.
Man lost everything except his faith in God.
Man lost everything but his faith in God. That's a good point. You notice how he said that? He lost everything but his faith in God. Most people will say, well, it's a book about suffering. The book of Job never does tell us why Job suffered. It just leaves that as the reality of life, that we are going to suffer. And if you haven't suffered yet in your Christian life, there's plenty of time left. You will, in some way or another. I tell you, the question of the book of Job seems to me to be twofold. These are two halves of the same coin. One is, can God trust man to serve him when his pain is so excruciatingly painful and can see no reward in sight? Can God trust man to serve him then? And the flip side of that is, can God trust man when his pain is so painful and so excruciating? Can he trust God? That's the other side of it. The book of Job doesn't necessarily answer that in a word or two. It answers it throughout the book, if we stop and think about it. Now, I want to, most of the time all we read is the first couple chapters, and then we flip to the end, chapter 42. And that's all we know. But, some of the great things that are in the book of Job are in that debate between his friends and Job. I mean, we miss a lot of great anecdotal sort of statements. I mean, Job is sarcastic. So are his friends. Job said, well, after listening to his friends for a while, said, no doubt when you die, all wisdom will die with you. Elihu, the young upstart, comes on the scene, and what he says about wisdom is that by reason of age, wisdom does not necessarily come by reason of age. Looking at these 3, 4 older men, and he makes that observation. Just because you're old doesn't mean you're smart or wise. But really, when you look at the book of Job and you come to the end of it, there's some insight in there. But there's also some insight from the New Testament I want to appeal to first, and that's in James 5, when he said, we have heard of the suffering of Job. Now listen to what he says here. This backs up, at least in some ways, what I said to you about when we read the Bible, we need to see what it's telling us about God. In James 5 and verse 20, I believe it is. Not verse 20, but how about verse 11. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Well, now, during a good part of that book of Job, Job doesn't really think God's all that compassionate, all that merciful. He starts questioning God. And, it comes to the end of the book when God says to Job, and here's the key difference that you have to understand in the book. After the Lord, verse 7, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls, 7 rams, go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has. What was the difference between them? They both were speaking of God. Job was speaking to God. That's the difference. He was speaking to God when he spoke. These men thought that they were the defenders of God. They were going to come in and defend God and show Job that he's this great sinner. Because after all, everybody knows the only people that suffer are those that sin. That's what they were arguing. That piety pays and perversity punishes. And so, Job, you must be a great sinner, otherwise you wouldn't be suffering. And they would argue that this is God's great plan. God says, no, that's not my plan. You're speaking of me, that which is not true. That's his whole point in what he's trying to get across. Now, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, the 3 friends of Job. Probably the best work that they did was when they came and sat with him 7 days in silence and said nothing. It's probably the best work they did. They misread everything that Job would say. Job, what they got really upset was with Job in Job 3, that he lamented the day of his birth, even the night of his conception. He said, it'd been better if I just died. And they thought that was borderline blasphemy toward God. And they started in on him about blaspheming God. Job said some pretty rough things, but he was saying them to God. He never cursed God. He never denied God. He never gave up his faith in God. He just thought God had marked him and put a target on his back and was shooting these arrows at him every chance he got. And so he was suffering. His suffering went on for months. So bad was his suffering that, he was emaciated. His bones were sticking out. People couldn't stand the sight of him. He looked so bad. You ever see when somebody's so sick that you could hard to look at him? And that's the way Job was. And so you have to ask yourself, why would a person go through that for the sake of God? The only thing I can tell you is he believed God was real. If you believe God is real, and God puts you through the test, you're going to go through it. I mean, we have it in Abraham and Isaac. God tested him. And so God's testing Job about his faith. Can God trust man to serve him when his pain is so excruciating and painful? You see, the devil comes along and says, no, he won't. He'll give everything he has to save his life. God says, well, you can do anything you want to him, but you can't kill him. And so he struck him the first time. He killed everything. You ever think about that in the first chapter where he steals his livestock or kills his livestock, then all of his children die by a hurricane or a windstorm of some sort, and just how hard that is to imagine losing everything you have, as our brother said a moment ago. Losing everything you have. Who are you going to put your faith in? I mean, the Old Testament doesn't attempt to explain suffering, but it does help us to live with it. I have a friend who lost a daughter very early. She was 20, 21 years old. And I said, how do you get over that? He said, you don't get over it. You just learn how to live with it. And I think that's true with suffering. You don't learn to get over it. You just learn how to deal with it. Trusting in God is the only thing you can do. I like to tell people that the best is always yet to come in Jesus. And so don't ever get so low in your faith that you don't know where to turn. There's not a night so dark. There's not a pain so painful. There's not a tragedy so tragic that in Christ there is light at the end of the tunnel. There's light. It's there. You just hang on with what you got. Sometimes it gets pretty threadbare. But remember who's on the other end of the rope that you're hanging on to. It's God. So that seems to me to be what Job says in chapter 1 when he had lost everything that he had. And verse 20, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And then God takes us, he makes another wager with the devil. I don't know what else you call it. Folks, you may not like it, but it's a wager. Try my servant Job. See what he does. Well, he'll curse you if you take away his health. God said, well, you can do anything you want to him, but you can't kill him. Indicating a couple things to us. One, Satan can do a lot of things to us, but he has no more power over us than what God allows him to have. And in today's world, since this side of the cross, he has no more power over us than what we allow him to have. Hebrews 2, verse 14. Wherefore it behooved him to be made in all things like unto his brothers. He tasted the power of death for us. And for those who all their lifetime were subject to fear of death. He freed us from that fear. The devil can't do that to us anymore. So he only has what power over us that we allow him to have. Now, in chapter 2, we have this, I think about him losing all of his livestock to marauders or fire, his children to the windstorm, and losing everything. But I wonder if his greatest loss wasn't that of the faith of his wife. The one he thought he could depend on for help and encouragement. In verse 9, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, I want to say something to you about that, the question I just asked. She suffered as much as Job did when she lost her kids. That wasn't just a painful for Job. That's a mother's love. And so then she also sees her husband struggling with all of these pains and afflictions and these boils or whatever they were all over his flesh. And she says, well, maybe it's just better if you go ahead and die. I mean, it's her love for him that really is saying that to him. Though it's a foolish thing to say, you do understand why she would make that statement to him. It doesn't make it right. I'm just saying that may be a possibility. So I don't like to be too hard on her. She suffered as much as Job did. So we read in verse 11, now when Job's 3 friends heard all the evil that had come upon them, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. That's how disfiguring his affliction was. They didn't even recognize him. So it was very great. His suffering, it says, was very great. So Job makes a statement about lamenting his day of birth. He goes out to the ash heap, scrapes himself with a potsherd. You know, he sees a broken piece of pottery and he starts scraping the sores off of them, hoping that would help and probably get infected. I don't know what else happens, but then Eliphaz finally speaks. He's the old man. He's the wise one. He speaks in chapter 4, and he says, if one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking? Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made him firm. You have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God, your confidence, and integrity of your ways, your hope? More so than Eliphaz it was. But he begins to chide him. He begins to, so I say this to you. One of the things that we learn from the book of Job is how not to comfort people when they're hurting. I mean, Job has an answer for chapter 4 and chapter 5 when Job finally speaks and says to them in chapter 6, he said, oh, that my vexation were weighed and all my calamity laid in the balances. For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks the poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. And at the very end of the chapter, he makes this point. He says, teach me and I will be silent. That is, tell me where I've sinned and I'll be silent. Make me understand how I've gone astray. How forceful are upright words. But what does reproof from you reprove? What's the reproof that you're giving me? Do you think that you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? He said, are you going to take seriously my suffering, my pain, everything that I've lost, and then going to mock everything that I say? I've heard people in the church when they've lost a loved one, maybe even a child. I'm not coming back to church again if God's going to do that to me. Well, I don't try to answer them right then and there. Would I say that? No, I don't think so. I hope not. But at the same time, they are so grief-stricken. And I would talk to them about it later. And they don't mean it half the time, and that's what Job is saying here. People don't mean what they say. Are you going to listen to the words of a despairing man and put those down as anchors and say that this is what he meant? Well, only if you want to be an enemy to him. And so, we learned how not to comfort. Don't take every word that a suffering person says as gospel. Understand. And then later, you may talk to them about it if you want. Eliphaz is sort of the traditionalist. Bildad is sort of the elitist sort of guy. And Zophar, he only gives 2 speeches. The rest of them give 3. But he is, how do we describe Zophar? He is sort of the New Age guy. He believes in dreams and probably crystals and all that sort of thing. I don't know. But he sort of is of that persuasion of seeing things and visions and that sort of thing. So when we look at the book of Job, we need to put it in a context of Job's suffering and understand some things about what he says. I will tell you one thing about Job that I love, is that sometimes he gets down into the valley of suffering. And then it's almost like he's talked himself out of it, and he comes that much higher in his faith. And he'll go along there, and then all of a sudden he'll drop down in the valley of despair and lift right back up. and higher than he was the last time. I think there's a reason for that. Just as much, I tell you something else. One reason we don't read the whole book of Job is because it is so monotonous. I mean, they're just going back and forth and fussing over words like wind and that sort of thing. But you know what onomatopoeic words are? They're words that sound like like ring or buzz and those sort of words. Well, I think the book of Job is sort of onomatopoeic. All suffering is monotonous. It's boring. And so I think the book is meant to be that way. To tell us, even in boring suffering and monotony and the pain of it all. I mean, I know people that live in constant pain that are Christians. But they make the best of it. So when we read about Job, I mean, there are times when he would say, I loathe my life. I would not live forever. One of the lowest points in Job is in chapter 9 and verse 20 and 21, 22. He said, though I am in the right, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I am blameless, he, God, would prove me perverse. I am blameless. I regard not myself. I loathe my life. Why does he loathe his life? Because he knows what he's about to say is a pretty strong indictment of God. And so, I mean, if this is the way it's going to be, I loathe my life. And then he goes on to say, it is all one, therefore I say. He destroys both the blameless and the wicked. In other words, what he's saying, it doesn't make any difference to God whether man does good or evil. Well, that's not right. He should have never said that. But he soon corrects himself, and he's saying it to God in light of who he is and what he's going through. He's telling God, because he's saying to God, I want to come before you and I want to argue my case. And I want to challenge you on what's happening. But he also understands in verse 32 of chapter 9, for he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both. Let him take his rod away from me, and let not the dread of him terrify me. Then I would speak without fear of him, for I am not so in myself. In other words, what he's saying is, I would talk to God face to face, but I know better. Now, the only way I could talk to God face to face is if he takes my suffering away from me for just a few moments, because I don't want to say something that's not right before God. But in my suffering, if I speak, I will. Let him take that away from me. And secondly, let him take away the dread, the fear of seeing God face to face. So he still has this tremendous amount of respect for who God is. He still sees God as creator, as sovereign. And so what he's saying in this text is, I could speak without fear of him if he would take away my dread, my suffering, and take away the dread of my fear of him terrifying me or seeing him. So he begins to lift himself up out of the valley in this and goes to some really high places. He says in verse 8 of chapter 10, your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. Remember that you have made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? You clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me together with bones and sinews. You have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit. I mean, through it all, he says, God has cared enough about me to preserve my spirit. He loves me. The other interesting thing about Job, as he speaks to God, and as we just read here, he asked God a number of questions. A number of questions. And when God finally comes on the scene and he begins to interrogate Job, you would think that of all the questions that Job has asked him, I've never gone through, and I should someday, go through and number and list all the questions Job asked God. But when God finally appears on the scene out of the whirlwind in Job 38, he never answers a single question that Job raised. You know that? I mean, Job must have asked him, I'm guessing 40 or 50 questions about his suffering. God never answered a single one. Do you know why? I'm just guessing here. I'm guessing if God had answered them, there'd still be another question. You ever play 20 questions with your kids? There's always one more question. Always one more. My mother would say, if I answer this question, you promise not to ask me any more questions. She would answer the question. I'd say, well, but no more questions. That's what our agreement was. There'll always be another question. Though God did not answer Job a single question in his suffering, he gave him the one answer that he needed. And that is that as he interrogates Job and puts him on the hot seat, it is a reminder to Job that God was with him through it all. From the moment that the boil struck him and he was sitting on the ash heap of the city dump, God was with him. And that's when Job says, I put my hand to my mouth and I will repent in sackcloth and ashes. It says in Job 42 and verse 6, I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now I know. So let me tell you something, folks. Job came away with a greater appreciation for God than he could have ever had he not gone through the suffering. And so can we. Where's God when I suffer? He's right there with me. He's right there. And that's what he wants us to know. Anybody got any comments or anything they want to make? My time is up again, I think. What time is this over?
Yeah, 15 more minutes.
Oh, I got 15 more. I was thinking the hour. Okay, well, good. Anybody have any questions? Anything they want to add? Any thoughts?
I have a question, Bill.
Yes, please.
So in light of 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, where God tells us that no temptation is overtaking you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. So that temptation will also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. In the case of Job, and particularly his wife, Job was able to bear it, but it doesn't appear that his wife was able to bear it.
Yeah.
So, you know, as a lessons for us, I mean, we can see that you know, God allows Satan to tempt us.
Yes.
And God allows Satan to do almost anything to us. But if we're faithful, we can come out the other side.
Yeah, and we'll come out with a greater appreciation for God. I mean, don't you think when Abraham offered Isaac and God said, for now I know. In other words, what God knew, now Abraham knows.
But I always struggle with the specifics of God's conversation with Satan and this example of Job and his family there. But do you have any comments on the temptation that faced his wife and how this all came about?
Well, I would say that when you go back to verse 10 of chapter 42, and the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters, all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house, and they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. I mean, he says pretty much the Lord brought that on him. I don't think directly. I think indirectly through Satan he did that, and I think that's the context. But God has a permissive will that he allows things to happen. All those who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer. 2 Timothy 2, verse 12. So, as to his wife, I think she probably regained her footing at some point, and because they have children again, and it doesn't say that he remarried. So I'm assuming she gave him more children, and God blessed her with the fortunes. I think that's probably another thing about the book of Job too, is that what we learn about God's faithful people. I mean, did Job's sin bring about his suffering? And the answer is no. Did Job sin, though, during the midst of his suffering? Yeah, he probably said some things he shouldn't have said. The Job 9, verse 20, 21, all is one with God, whether man does good or evil. What he's saying is there's no moral government in the universe. Well, that's not true. God does punish the wicked eventually and reward the righteous. So that's not right. There are other things that he said too. And he said he repented. He repented in sackcloth and ashes. And he put his hand to his mouth and said things that were too wonderful for him to know. Who can thwart the purpose of God, he said. And so I'll also say this, and maybe this will help a little bit too. I sometimes wonder if in the book of Job, one of the things that God isn't telling us is that while it doesn't look fair to us, and you know as a parent, and I know as a parent, that we got so tired of our kids saying, that's not fair. I got so tired of my teenagers saying that when they were teenagers. And, well, life's not fair. When did you wake up thinking it was supposed to be? I never told you that. Well, we see the unfairness of things that happen in the Bible. And in the book of Job, we see that God stands at the head of things and ultimately makes them right. You know, he didn't restore Job's fortune from his suffering. He restored them in his suffering. And he was still suffering when God interrogated him. And I'm sure, and I know at some point all of it left and he was healed and restored. But you and I both know people that have had super attitudes about their suffering and been able to weather the storm. And just with a bright, cheerful attitude. And it's just kind of amazing to us. But they'll all say it's their faith. And how many times have we said, I wonder what people do who don't have faith when they face tragedies. I mean, I felt that way. So, you know, while Job's wife knew Job believed in God, I think in her defense a little bit, we have to say that she suffered as much as he did. And he didn't, but she got back on the right footing, I would say. I hope that helped some. I don't know if it did or not. Anybody have any other comments?
Well, Bill, I was thinking about earlier, talked about Job was speaking to God, and perhaps maybe the friends were acting like they knew the mind of God.
Yeah.
So it makes me think about the times when we declared that God did something. Especially people try to do this at funerals. Well, God needed another angel, right?
Yeah.
Or some other sort of, this cliche saying
Right.
of the mind of God. So it makes me think we have to be very careful speaking out of place for God.
Yeah, God needs defending about like a lion does. No, he can defend himself, and we do. I mean, I think intentions may be good, but that doesn't make what we say right. Anybody have anything else? One of my favorite things about God interrogating Job, I tell you where the turning point was for Job, it seems to me, is when God finally says to him, let me get it here in my text. I mean, there are some funny things I think God says to him. Like how stupid the ostrich is, you're kind of acting that way too. In verse 13 and 14 of chapter 39. Okay. Yeah, this is, I think, the turning point for Job is in chapter 40, beginning of verse 7. Or verse 6, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, do you ask for action like a man? I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowing of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and obeys him. In other words, bring down the proud. Punish them. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. That is, send them to the grave. Bind their faces in the world below. Then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. You know what he's saying to Job is, Job, you want to be judged? I don't want to be judged. I can just tell you right now. I don't want you to be judged either. No offense, but you're not perfect like God is. And so he's saying to Job, if you can decide who ought to go to heaven and who ought to go to hell, and you can do it correctly, then I'll surrender and say, you can save yourself by your own right hand. But you can't do it. And so Job is really saying then, in essence, in chapter, it says in verse 42, after God left him to chew on that, he said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Job said, I spoke when I should have been listening. I said things I should never have said. He comes to realize. I don't know if you all know who Shel Silverstein is. He was a writer. He wrote several children's books. The Growing Tree was one of them. I can't remember some of the other ones that he wrote, Up the Down Staircase or something like that. But he's very clever and everything else. But he wrote a poem, and it always reminds me of Job, called The Bus Driver. And so it was about a bus driver driving a bus, and this guy said, hey, when are we going to stop? When are we going to go to lunch? When are we going to see this? The bus driver stops. Says, hey, you want to drive the bus? He said, yeah, I'll take a shot at it. So he started driving the bus, and the guy said, when are we going to stop? Where are we going to go eat at? He said, well, I don't know. And he said, well, get out of the way. You're not qualified to drive the bus. Now, that's a really bad paraphrase of that poem. You can look it up online. But it's sort of like Job. Job's wanting to drive the bus, but he's not ready to drive it. He can't drive it. And that's what God is trying to help him to see. You want to drive this bus. You want to be God in heaven from the earth, but you can't do that. And that's what he's getting at. Any other comments or questions? All right, I'm going to give a couple extra minutes and stop there. Thank you for listening.